fish and chip shop might be the single most British business there is. It survived 2 world wars, rationing, the rise of every fast food chain America ever exported, and decades of changing British tastes. It's one of the few foods the government has actually protected by law during wartime, because morale mattered that much. Here's what it hasn't survived well the last 4 years. The president of the National Federation of Fish Fryers has called the current situation the most dangerous threat to the industry in 160 years. Industry surveys have suggested that as much as a fifth to a third of Britain's chip shops could close within a single year. The price of cod alone has in some cases tripled, so by the end of this video you'll understand exactly what it costs to run a chippy, why its margin is more exposed to global commodity markets than almost any other small business on the high street, and why the very thing that makes fish and chips taste the way it does, deep frying in bulk every single day, has become one of the most expensive habits a small business can have. A traditional chip shop looks simple: fish, chips, a fryer, a counter. But as a business, it's really running 2 entirely separate supply chains under one roof, and each one exposes the owner to a completely different set of risks. The fish side. Cod and haddock aren't grown or farmed to order. They're wild-caught, quota-controlled, globally traded commodities, priced in a market the shop owner has zero influence over. A shop's fish cost can move dramatically within a single year, entirely independent of how many customers walk through the door. The chip side. Potatoes and cooking oil look like simpler, homegrown ingredients, but they're just as exposed. Potato yields depend on the weather, fertilizer costs move with global energy and gas prices, and the sunflower and vegetable oil used in the fryer is a globally traded commodity too, vulnerable to shocks in completely unrelated parts of the world. Layer on top of both of those the single biggest operational difference between a chippy and almost any other food business: continuous deep frying. A chip shop's fryers run hot for most of the trading day, which makes energy one of its largest fixed costs. Not an occasional expense, but a core running cost that scales with every hour the shop is open, regardless of how busy it is. Independent chip shops don't have the buying power of a national chain. They can't negotiate bulk cheap fish contracts the way a supermarket can, and they can't spread a bad month across dozens of other locations. That means the gap between what a portion costs to make and what it sells for has to do all the work. Here's what that gap looks like today. The average price of a takeaway, whereas fish and chips in the UK reached £11 and 2 pence in 2026, up 10% on the year before. Some regional pricing has pushed considerably higher. Portions costing £12 to £14 have been reported in several parts of the country. On the surface, that looks like healthy pricing power. In practice, it's been almost entirely eaten by rising input costs, not converted into extra profit. Consider what's happened to the fish alone. One award-winning chip shop owner in Yorkshire described a 20-kilogram box of cod rising from £110 in December 2024 to £330 by 2026, a 200% increase in roughly a year. Icelandic cod has been reported doubling from around £8 to £16 a kilo within months. Layer that on top of separately reported rises of around 30% on potatoes, 60% on the sunflower oil used for frying, and 38 to 45% on packaging, and you get a picture where nearly every single input a chippy depends on rose sharply, in some cases simultaneously. For a business already operating on the tight margins typical of independent hospitality, that's not a gradual squeeze. It's several squeezes landing in the same till at once. Here's what most customers are queuing at their local chippy never think about. A portion of fish and chips sits at the end of one of the most geopolitically exposed supply chains in British food retail. Roughly 40% of the whitefish fillets supplied to UK chip shops have historically come from Russia. Following sanctions connected to the war in Ukraine, the industry faced the prospect of a new tariff of around 35% on Russian whitefish imports, pushing shops to lean harder on Norwegian and Icelandic supply, which itself has been under pressure from reduced fishing quotas. UK, EU and Norwegian quota negotiations have cut permitted cod catches by as much as 44% in a single year, citing concerns that cod stocks are critically low from decades of overfishing. On top of that, cooking oil costs spiked sharply after the invasion of Ukraine disrupted sunflower oil supply, one of the primary frying oils used across the industry. And more recently, disruption in the Strait of Hormuz has been linked to rising costs for both red diesel, which powers fishing trawlers, and cooking oil, illustrating just how far upstream a shock has to travel before it shows up as a higher number on a chip shop's chalkboard. Put simply, a chippy's biggest cost lines, fish, oil, and increasingly energy, are all set by international commodity and energy markets that can move sharply because of a war, a quota negotiation, or a shipping lane thousands of miles away. Almost none of that is within an owner's control, and very little of it can be hedged against by a single independent shop the way a large national chain might manage it. Moi, put the commodity exposure and the energy cost together, and the closure numbers stop looking abstract. Industry body surveys earlier in this crisis found that around 2/3 of chip shops had already reduced their opening hours to save money, a change estimated to be equivalent to a fall in staffing of around 4 people per shop. That's not a business trimming costs at the edges. That's a business cutting its own trading hours, and therefore its own revenue, simply to survive the cost side of the ledger. The National Federation of Fish Fryers has published survey findings suggesting that as much as a fifth of UK chip shops could close within a year, and separate industry estimates from insolvency specialists have put that figure as high as a third. The Federation's own president has repeatedly described the situation using words like extinction event and the most dangerous threat the trade has faced in over a century and a half. And unlike some of the other small businesses in this series, there's no single villain here. No PBM, no UDA formula, no one national contract to point to. It's the accumulation of several separate global commodity shocks landing on a business that was already running on a thin, hospitality-typical margin, with none of the buying power that lets a supermarket or a national chain absorb the same increases and barely notice. Unlike pharmacies or dentists, there's no national reimbursement reform coming to fix this from the top down. Owners are adapting the business itself instead. Species substitution. A growing number of chippies have started frying alternative species, Norwegian pollock, South African hake, New Zealand hoki, as a lower cost substitute for cod and haddock. One Yorkshire owner told the BBC he can sell pollock at a noticeably lower price point and still make a reasonable profit on it, arguing the traditional shop is going to go unless the trade diversifies what it fries. Not everyone in the industry agrees this alone solves the problem. Some fish merchants argue British customers are simply loyal to cod and haddock, and that in the long run the trade has to accept and pass on the real price of those species. Government relief that already exists, fuel duty cuts and a 50% business rates relief for eligible high street businesses have been in place to help offset some of the pressure, alongside a freeze on the business rates multiplier. Though the industry's own trade body has continued pushing for more direct help, particularly around VAT and energy costs specifically. Public campaigning. A campaign called Save the Great British Fish and Chip Shop, launched by an insolvency firm, has aimed to raise public awareness of the pressure the sector is under, essentially asking customers to keep choosing their local chippy even as prices rise, because every closure removes both a business and often a genuine community fixture from a high street. None of these are a structural fix in the way a funding reform is for pharmacies or dentists. They're closer to survival tactics for a business exposed to forces well outside the UK's own borders. Scenario 1, a traditional cod and haddock only chip shop in a small town. This shop is the most exposed version of the business, fully dependent on the two fish species that have seen the sharpest price rises, no diversification into other proteins, and reliant on footfall from a single local area rather than delivery platforms or wholesale. Scenario 2, a diversified, multi-species chip shop with an efficient kitchen. This shop offers pollock, hake, or hoki alongside cod and haddock, giving customers a genuinely cheaper option that still protects some margin and has likely invested in more energy-efficient fryers and extraction to control its single largest fixed cost. It may also run a wider menu. Kebabs, pizza, chicken, spreading commodity risk across more than just whitefish and potatoes. Either way, the fundamentals are the same. A business built on one of Britain's most beloved meals, running on a margin that depends on decisions made by fishing quota negotiators in Norway, oil markets reacting to wars thousands of miles away, and an energy bill that has no domestic price cap to protect it. Whether the chippy survives the next few years depends less on how good the fish tastes and more on how exposed its supply chain happens to be when the next global shock inevitably lands.